Ahora vamos a pasar a la siguiente.
Let us move on to my next suggestion for you, and that is you should use the data population associated with transactions. This is something that appeared in version 15, so that you can use the physical tables created on the basis of transactions. So we're going to see how you needn't make procedures on your own or solve it on your own. It's very simple, as I said. For all transactions on the basis of GeneXus 15, we are adding the property data provider. Now, that is false. And when we put it to true for a transaction, you have two things. On the one hand, GeneXus creates a data provider, and we can see it's called with the name of the transaction of data provider, and you're going to see it in the K-Explorer under the transaction. And then it initializes its source with the structure of the transaction. That's the comment I get. Now, I only simply turn on this data provider function, and what's happened is that the data provider was created associated to the transaction. Then one further transaction property is added, and then it's configured with data population. You're going to see there is another value for this property, which we're going to see it later on. So what I have to do, just that, is complete that data provided and save it. So what I've done is I copy this block of codes as many times as I needed and complete the data that I wanted to save, and just that on my physical table. Let's suppose that for another transaction I need to do the same. Now, before that, let me tell you this. When GeneXus finds that I said I wanted to have a data provider to populate, then it automatically turns on this property, this true component, to make the recordings. And so, as I said, let's suppose that for another transaction, everything is so quickly. I open it, I go to property, data provider, I turn it on true, and then automatically you get this property which is configured as I wanted it to be. I don't have to do anything there. You get this data provider, and it's completed in this way. I exit, and that's it. Now, the only thing you have to know is that this population is not done at the time you create the tables. Why not? Well, not to charge this creation process. You do it when you do F5, because in that way, that's when you need to see the data. When you're starting, when you have the application function, all the data must be in place. So when you do F5, at the end, you're going to see that these data providers have been executed in the output, and when you go to your first transaction that was populated, the data will be there. This is linked to transactions. It's linked to transactions, and you're going to see what happens with dynamic transactions in a minute, but we are using the transactions and not SDTs because it's the paradigm of using attributes. And well, this data provider, is facilitating all this. Data provider is, I have to create the blocks, and I don't have to exceed a variable, go to one single variable to get there. Well, look, at present, we have loaded the SDTs with data providers. We're not recommending using procedures and making a loop and going add and asking for memory. We're going to get there in a minute, but the data provider is a provider of data, and it will return the data that you have to load into a SDT memory, or in this case, it's linked to the transaction to facilitate matters. So the data provider, this is precisely to facilitate. To copy is nothing. I mean, what I'm doing as a task is doing. I mean, it's simply turning on a property and then fill it in and save it. And I do this. It's very, very easy. And then you don't have to create other objects. That is, there is no need for anything else. I'm sorry if this is not clear. I'll explained again. Now, you said that when you are using F5. No, please give me some time. Now, you can execute this data provider. With F5 automatically, you'll be able to execute it like any other data provider, and we're going to give the data to a collection. I'm going to see that in a minute. I'm using it already. And perhaps I'm a bit confused, but perhaps I'm doing something wrong. I would expect that with these properties, I would have a table. But apparently, it's just a view. Well, your question is all right, yes. What you're saying is when this property doesn't have any data population, is when it has retrieved data. We're going to see it in a minute. We're going to see that case in a minute. This is just to populate physical tables.
Vamos a ver algunas cosas a tener en cuenta.
We're going to see some of the things that we have to take into account. Now, the data provider may be executed several times. Why? Well, because when it may be executed when the physical structures of the tables associated with the transaction change, or when the data provider is modified. Let's suppose that in that country transaction, I add cities as a second level. Most certainly, the data provider may change or not. It may go on, and I may complete it with certain cities in those countries. Now, it will be executed once again when I click on F5. Now, what I have to know is that the operation that will be executed in the database is an upsert. So we're going to try to insert, and when it's a duplication, it will update the record. Let's see it in practice. Let's suppose that I've defined this data provider associated to this transaction. I simply turned this property on. That's automatic. It was created. I completed it and saved it. And F5. Click on F5. I execute it, and then I can see that I have 5 currencies. Then I come to GeneXus, and I add another currency, for instance, Mexican pesos. I exit, and I click on F5. What happens? It tries to insert this currency, and because the key is already there, it's updating this value. That's why we call it upsert. It tries to insert it, it fails because there is a duplication, and it updates it until it comes to Mexican pesos, which was not there, and it inserts it. So that's what we call an upsert. So we have to know that, it executed several times. I come and go, F5, and I see the results. Now, the operation is upsert. And then since the data provider can be run several times, then the developer must have that into account, must take it into account. And it has to make sure that it's an idempotent behavior. We don't have to have repeated data. For instance, if I had defined autonamer, if this is a code, but if I defined it differently, I wouldn't have to indicate that because it's already got an automatic number. Now, what happens is that I click F5, I get a number. Now, the duplicated key won't fail. It will give a new number where data are repeated. It's an alternative to be taken into account when it is adjusted to reality is to define a unique index by name. And in this case, it would be good because we don't want to have the same number of a currency twice. It's going to have a new number. Because of the unique number I've defined, there I will see that I've already defined it and it will be updated. And there, in that case, I don't have any duplication of data. Lastly, and what you have just asked me, to execute this, to run this in production, well, we don't do F5 because that's in the prototype environment. But we need to run country data provider or the currency data provider, whatever we need. And since a data provider, as defined by GeneXus, but it's used like any other, it will give me the data in this collection of countries. Now, let's see what type of variable this is. That variable, country collection, is of the business component, country, and I said it's a collection. Why? Well, because in a data provider that was automatically generated, I didn't put in a collection or a scale variable of SDT type. It's as if I had taken the business component. I didn't do it because GeneXus did it for me. Since it's associated to the transaction, what I have to return is a group of countries that I completed with the data, and that's a business component of countries that is a collection. Now, once I get those data, I have to apply a method, I have to use a method for that collection and record it in my database. Now, if here it said insert, you would understand that what I'm trying to do is to insert this data in the database. So I insert the insert update is the operation that upsert does, which I show you it's doing it by default by this data provider. Now, these methods are new in GeneXus 15, and this allows me to come to my next part. This is new things that GeneXus 15 included. So I have this collection. I applied it. If it's successful, I'm already asking about it. I write commit and commit, or I would initialize error and so on, and I will know about it. So let's move on to the new methods that were introduced in GeneXus 15 to be applied to business component variables.